After saying he was hungry, the protagonist suddenly felt his body grow weak. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the ground. A strange sensation took over him, as if his strength was being drained away. Just then, something unexpected happened. A small black hole appeared in the palm of his hand. It wasn't as massive as the one before, but it had the same mysterious pull. Before he could understand what was going on, the giant crystal that had formed earlier began to shake. Slowly, it started moving toward the black hole in his hand. Within moments, the entire crystal was sucked in, leaving him lying on the ground, alone and exhausted. Suddenly, he heard a voice. At first, it was faint, like a whisper in the wind, but soon it grew louder. The words became clear. It was demanding something back. The voice was filled with anger, frustration, and desperation. It echoed in his mind, making his head throb. He didn't recognize it, but somehow it felt familiar. Then he opened his eyes. Before him stood the dragon. It was just as massive and terrifying as before, with sharp fangs and piercing eyes filled with rage. The beast glared at him, its voice booming as it demanded the return of its body. Its presence was overwhelming, shaking the very air around them. Before the protagonist could react, the dragon lunged toward him, its mouth wide open, ready to swallow him whole. The moment felt endless as he braced himself for the attack. But then, he woke up. His body jerked upright as he gasped for air. He looked around, confused and disoriented. The cold, sterile walls and the steady beeping of machines told him he was in a hospital. The nightmare had felt so real. But now he was here, alive. His mind raced. How was he still breathing? He had been eaten, torn apart completely. There was no way he should be alive. Was it all a dream? As he struggled to process everything, his eyes landed on his palm. A strange, dark mark was there. It wasn't a wound, nor was it a scar. It was something else, something unnatural. As he stared at it, a strange feeling spread through him. Then, something happened. Before he could react, something emerged from it. A tiny creature floated before him. It had small horns, delicate wings, and a faint glow around its body. Despite its size, it carried an air of arrogance. The creature stared at him with sharp eyes and, in a high-pitched voice, demanded something unexpected. It wanted its body back. The protagonist was taken aback. He had no idea what this thing was or where it had come from. Was it the dragon? The strongest species that had once stood before him? He couldn't believe it. This tiny, almost ridiculous-looking creature was claiming to be the same terrifying beast. The small being, clearly offended by his doubt, puffed up and declared itself as the ruler of all extraterrestrial life. It insisted that it was still the strongest species. The protagonist stared at it, unconvinced. Where was the terrifying aura, the overwhelming power? This thing didn't seem dangerous at all. Seeing his disbelief, the tiny dragon became frustrated. It pointed to the patterns on its horns, insisting they were proof of its identity. The protagonist examined them closely, and to his surprise, they did resemble the markings of the dragon he had fought. But even so, he found it hard to accept. The creature, determined to prove itself, confidently declared that it would reveal its true name, a name known only to a select few in the universe. It stood tall, as if preparing for a grand moment. Then, silence. Its expression changed as confusion set in. It couldn't remember its own name. The protagonist lost his patience. Frustration boiling over, he threw a punch at the tiny creature, sending it tumbling through the air. But he wasn't done. Grabbing it, he squeezed it tightly, shaking it furiously. How could it call itself the strongest species when it had caused so much destruction? Did it not realize how many people had died because of it? His classmates, his friends, so many had been killed. And now this small, ridiculous creature was acting as if nothing had happened? Anger surged through him as he tightened his grip. He demanded answers. He wanted justice. The tiny dragon, struggling to speak as it was being squeezed, let out a muffled protest. In a strained voice, it told him the truth. He had already devoured it. The boy froze. The dragon explained that when it had eaten him, something had gone wrong. Instead of completely consuming him, its own body had been pulled inward. The roles had reversed. The predator had become the prey. And now, the boy's body was made from the dragon's very essence. The protagonist's mind reeled at the revelation. The tiny dragon, still stuck in his grip, continued to grumble. It explained that it had been the one to consume him, but instead of digesting him, its own form had been taken in, and now this was all that was left of it. The boy loosened his hold, staring at the tiny creature in disbelief. This being, once feared as the ultimate predator, was now nothing more than a small, powerless remnant of what it used to be. And somehow, his own existence had become tied to it. The protagonist, still trying to process everything, suddenly sensed someone approaching. Panic surged through him as he quickly turned to the small dragon, urging it to hide before they were seen. Before he could think of a proper hiding spot for the tiny creature, the door swung open. A familiar figure entered the room. The Ice Princess, a high-ranking warrior. Her sharp eyes widened in shock when she saw him sitting up in bed. Relief washed over her face as she rushed to his side, exclaiming his name with a mix of disbelief and happiness. She had been told he was unconscious, but now, after an entire week, he was finally awake. Seeing him alive was a miracle. The protagonist, still feeling weak, looked at her and recognized her as someone from Hachi school. She introduced herself properly as Hyuga Orin, and with a casual smile he decided to call her simply Orin. His relaxed attitude toward addressing someone of her rank caught her off guard, and she frowned slightly at his informal behavior. However, there were more serious matters to discuss. Her expression quickly hardened as she reminded him that he had ignored her orders during the previous battle. As a high ranker, it was her duty to protect civilians, and he had gone against direct instructions. She made it clear that such disobedience wouldn't be tolerated again. The protagonist, feeling a bit guilty, simply stated that he had only done what he could in that moment. He hadn't intentionally ignored orders. He had just acted on instinct. But before they could continue the discussion, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The air around them grew icy, sending a shiver down his spine. It didn't take him long to realize the source of the cold. It was coming from Orin herself. She had activated her power, her face now serious as she prepared to question him. She demanded answers about what had happened on that day a week ago. The strongest species had vanished without a trace, and he was the only known survivor. How had he managed to live through something that should have been impossible? Answering this question, she told him, was his responsibility to humanity. The protagonist, still trying to grasp the fact that a whole week had passed, was shocked. Had he really been unconscious for that long? Orion confirmed it, explaining that he had been in a coma at the 8th Special Forces Hospital ever since that fateful day. To help him understand the situation, she picked up the TV remote and turned on the screen. News reports flashed across the display, showing the state of the world after the strongest species' sudden disappearance. The entire event was still a mystery, and investigators were struggling to make sense of what had happened. According to the reports, all radio signals and surveillance equipment had been disrupted during the attack, making it impossible to capture any footage of the battle. No one had any solid evidence of what had occurred. However, there was one key detail that stood out. At the exact point where the strongest species had vanished, a lone boy had been spotted. The protagonist's heart pounded as he listened to the news. Could it be that the mysterious boy they were talking about was him? Oreen looked at him with piercing eyes and confirmed his suspicions. She was here to find out what truly happened outside the shelter that day. The strongest species had been an unimaginable threat, capable of wiping out humanity. If there was even the slightest chance that it still existed, they needed to locate and neutralize it immediately. As an S-ranker of the 8th Special Forces, it was Orion's duty to investigate, and depending on his answers, she would have to take necessary action. The protagonist felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. She wanted the truth. But the truth was something even he wasn't sure he fully understood. He hesitated, trying to piece together his fragmented memories. Before he could form a response, a voice suddenly rang inside his head. The small dragon. It mocked him for even considering telling the truth so easily. With an irritated tone, it reminded him that admitting what had happened could put his life in danger. If the humans found out that he had absorbed the strongest species and that his body was now made from it, they would surely see him as a threat. There was no way they would just let him walk free. The voice grew louder, echoing in his mind, causing him to clutch his head in pain. Orin immediately noticed his distress and asked if he was okay. He quickly brushed it off, saying it was just a headache. Meanwhile, the tiny dragon smirked, feeling satisfied that the protagonist was finally realizing the gravity of the situation. It warned him again. Telling the truth would mean his death. Even though the small dragon insisted that lying was the only way to protect himself, he couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. Still gripping the tiny dragon like a plush toy, he made up his mind. Looking straight at Oreen, he decided to tell her everything. He confessed that he had devoured the strongest species using his alpha ability, and as proof, he showed her the strange mark in his palm. The small dragon panicked, realizing what he had just done. It called him a fool, warning that he had just put himself in danger. Oreen, who had been listening carefully, stared at him in shock. Processing his words, her expression changed. What would happen now? Would she see him as an enemy? Or would she believe his story? The fate of the protagonist now hung in the balance.